Well, welcome class to our last project. My name's Philip Johnson. I will be doing a brief presentation here on the two papers that I did. The first one being from Acts chapter 16 verses 16 through 40, and that was the narrative approach from Rezaguet, and the second one being Luke 23:28 through 31. Initially, the Old Testament paper, Luke's use of the Old Testament, I had picked a larger pericope, but once you got into it, as I'm sure some of the rest of you have discovered, that if there's 15 verses in Luke, there's probably a lot of allusions, and that makes it really difficult to keep the paper to a 10-page to 15-page minimum. And so I actually shrunk it down to just 4 verses and found that in those 4 verses there was one citation and then a couple of allusions. So Luke 23:38 through 31 is Jesus is on his way carrying the cross, and he's being followed by mourners, and he stops and turns to them and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry?" That first couple verses is more allusion, and the allusion isn't as clear until you see the citation, which is in verse 30. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us, which is almost word for word quotation of Hosea 10:8. And when you actually read the entire chapter of Hosea, you discover that the first preceding verses actually flow very well with what is being said in Hosea. Now, the Acts 16 pericope, 16 through 40, is when Paul and the group of missionaries are in Philippi. They've met Lydia. They've ministering on the outskirts of town. They're on their way into town to pray, and they're met by this fortune teller who begins to follow them around proclaiming, "These are the men of the Most High God. These are the men of the Most High God." And Paul finally gets fed up with it, casts the spirit out of her, which angers the people who were controlling her because he's cut into their finances and their influence, and so they have them thrown in jail. While in jail, they sing and make praises to God. There's an earthquake that shakes them free, but they don't leave. The jailer wants to, because he's afraid they've escaped, and they say, "Hey, wait a second, don't kill yourself, that's not a good idea." And so he doesn't. Family gets baptized, he's baptized, and there's a resolution where Paul and Silas point out the fact that Paul's like, "Hey, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't just do this." And there's a complete turnabout, almost like what happens with in the story of Esther. Same kind of deal where they want to beat them, they do beat them, and they imprison them, and they're going to do further, and they find out they're Romans, and then they end up having to be freed. But not just freed, they end up having to go around town and legitimize Paul and Silas on top of everything else that they've done. And then Paul and Silas finally leave with a work firmly established in Macedonia, Philippi. What's interesting is that it kind of at the heart of Luke's Gospel and Acts, you find a common theme of acceptance and rejection. It's in the two pericopes, although they're not necessarily the same kind of a story, there is this Jesus is on his way to the cross, and it's because Luke is like it's pushing us to either accept or reject him. And he's at a moment when he's been rejected by some, and you see Jesus in the midst of that rejection expressing concern. Don't weep for me. What's coming to you is much worse. And then you jump ahead to Acts, and you see the same thing in the midst of rejection. Paul Paul and Silas are singing praises and they're reaching out for people. And you see the jailer accepting what they have to offer. Now, with the Old Testament usage in Luke chapter 23, and as well as from Luke throughout Acts, you see a proliferation of citations and allusions to the Old Testament, which I'm sure everyone else has seen in their works, and that it's Luke is drawing a continuation of the narrative from the Old Testament to the life and times of Jesus and on into the further works of the church. There is this continuation of one great story that is a part of the story that began with the children of Israel, that began with the Torah, with the Old Testament. And you see this continuation throughout. And in the Luke passage where he's citing Hosea, he's actually citing a passage that has to do with the Mosaic law. He's citing the Old Testament and drawing a connection between what's happening to Jesus in that moment with the story of Israel. Just like in Hosea, they had misplaced their trust in the wrong leaders. And in Hosea, they're being warned, you're trusting the wrong leaders, judgment is coming to you for this. And here is Jesus on his way to the cross because once again they've misplaced their trust in the wrong leaders, in the wrong authority, and he's still calling out with concern, hey, something worse is coming for you because you've misplaced your trust. You jump ahead into Acts and into the passage in Acts 16 where the disciples are ministering. They're on a missionary journey, and they are on the outskirts of town initially before the pericope in particular focus, and they've established a work with the women of that area, but they're not in the main part of the area, and they move into this Acts 16 through 40, and once again, just like Jesus, they're telling people, you've misplaced your trust in the wrong spiritual forces, in the wrong leaders. And the narrative itself demonstrates how that trust in the wrong leadership ends up in their own judgment. And deliverance comes, once again, through the gospel. One of the interesting things about what happens in both this pericope in Luke 23 and Acts is that you have a public accusation, and that is a type that Luke uses repeatedly. So with Jesus, he's on his way to the cross because he's been publicly accused of something, wrongfully accused of something, and convicted of that thing, and he's going to the cross. In Acts chapter 16, the same thing is happening to his disciples. They're wrongfully accused, they're publicly accused, they're persecuted, they're placed in prison, and further harm is wanting to be done to them. But it doesn't happen because Luke is once again using a particular way of telling the story to show how the gospel is being furthered even in the midst of persecution. And in Acts particularly, this is one of a series of 4 public accusation types, and it's particularly with the Gentiles where they go into a city, they are accused of something and persecuted, and God uses that accusation to create a platform for the proclamation of the gospel. And it is a continual theme that actually takes place even going back to, you can see the ministry and life and times of Jesus, and it kind of harkens to the, you will be persecuted for my name's sake, and you should rejoice. And they did in Acts. They often rejoiced at the fact that they were being persecuted because they understood that Jesus and his mission and his cause was being proclaimed and furthered. In the Luke pericope, whenever Jesus gets up and makes this declaration, don't weep for me, worse is coming to you. This is actually the 3rd time in Luke's gospel that Jesus has made this warning. And for the 3rd time he said, hey, worse is coming to you. And what you're seeing here is a continual concern of Christ for the very people that are rejecting him. And he repeats it over and over. And interestingly, in Luke's gospel, the use of three tends to show up quite frequently. 3 times Peter's going to reject Jesus. 3 times he's told, feed my sheep. 3 times we have Jesus saying, hey, worse judgment is coming for you. 3 times we see him expressing concern for the children of Israel, for what they're doing and for what may be coming because of their rejection. And there is a certain irony that here is Jesus beaten, bloodied, carrying a cross on his way to death, and he's telling them, worse than what you've just seen done to me is coming to you. And there's this dramatic irony that Luke uses, and he uses it quite frequently. He uses it often throughout the Luke gospel, and then again in this Acts 16, you see the use of irony, and it is all throughout the story. You have they're on their way to pray, and supernatural forces are employed to try and hinder them. Paul has enough of that and says, get out of this possessed woman, and uses supernatural forces to, one, undermine the economic advantages of the people in that city, and then they're placed in a prison cell, and once again the supernatural works in their favor, and they're freed. And so here you have this play of pagan supernatural activity being upstaged by God's activity. You have the citizens of Macedonia and Philippi who want to imprison and quench and shut down what Paul and Silas are doing, and the end result is they end up having to even further legitimize and establish Paul and Silas's work. And Luke is excellent at bringing out this dramatic irony and to emphasize the power of the gospel, and it even kind of accentuates the transformative power of the gospel. But what's interesting is that when you read that Acts narrative and you start looking at the character development, you begin to see that what you would think is that the rounded, more full characters would be Paul and Silas. But the reality is, as you go through Ezegwe's way of breaking things down, it begins to show that they're actually flat characters. They're consistent. What they do stays the same. They're flat characters. The magistrates that are in opposition to them are flat characters. Actually, the central character is the jailer. This is the one character that has development, that has a conflict where there is a transformation of who he is. And even in the pericope itself, the way that it's split up, the story of the jailer comes in the center of the story. It kind of builds like an ABCBA arc to it, as a kind of a comedy arc to it, like a U-shaped arc. And central to it is this character of the jailer. And it is his transformation, where he is placed in the moment where he must either accept or reject the message of Paul and Silas. And his choice is to accept. And there's something powerful about the way Luke propels his narratives. And you have Jesus presenting constant concern and warning, and he tethers that concern to the same concern God had for his people in the Old Testament. And it carries throughout Luke, it carries throughout the Gospels, and it continues into Acts. And you see a God who is concerned with people who are in bondage. He is concerned with their rejection or their acceptance. And he's continually moving for those people. And if the ones who are central will not accept him, he will go to the furthest lengths of the world to find one who will accept the freedom that he has to offer. And it's just powerful and wonderful, and I hope all of your papers and your presentations came out and impacted you in a powerful way. I've really enjoyed the class. I'm sure the rest of you have as well. And I look forward to other classes we might have together. Signing out. Have a Merry Christmas.